Hey guys, welcome to the episode 24 of the 1020 Diesel Shop Talk podcast. Today we're going to talk about how to pick injectors. And it's not ever a simple answer, but we're going to try to break it down as much as possible. Before that though, if you don't know by the end of this how to choose your injectors, one of the things that we do, and I talk about this at the beginning of every podcast pretty much, is we do build plans. At this point, we've successfully completed about 1,000 of them. And maybe unsuccessfully didn't complete or did complete unsuccessfully a few more. But basically what we do is you can go on our website, you can click on the tab, plan my build, or plan your build, maybe it says. And it's just a form to fill out so we can collect some information about what it is you're looking to accomplish with your truck, what you do with your truck, how it's used, what you have now. There's just a list of questions on there. And when you submit that, then it's going to redirect you to a page where you can set up schedule a time, and you can select a time from, my schedule, from my calendar, and we'll sit down for, 30, 40 minutes and we'll talk about the build on your truck. And I guess it's more important in this discussion today to bring that up because more and more, the people that don't schedule calls, we still get tons of people that call in and have a lot of questions about how to choose the right parts, or, generally it's, kind of turns into a diagnostic discussion about maybe do they need injectors or not? Do you need a turbo or not? What are the problems anyway? We just goes on from there. And so it's really important to have a place to start from. And sadly, just asking questions on Facebook isn't going to get you a proper answer. It may answer some people's questions, but for the most part, it really isn't. And one of the things, and actually I'm kind of excited, Charlie Fish is going to be jumping on here, hopefully soon in the next couple weeks. Charlie Fish of KC Turbos. We had a discussion a couple weeks ago, and he kind of put to words something that I deal with a lot, and I think that probably few people can do. And any good diagnostician or any good mechanic or somebody who's really going to be able to offer you good advice on what to do with your truck, and I think he is one of them. We have our disagreements, but we can agree on a lot of things too. Is that he said I don't have, and I might be misquoting, but basically I don't have the answers to everything or anything. But I do know that if I can have a conversation with someone willing to explain and learn, that I know how to ask the right questions next to get to the answer. And that's I think that's a really good way to put it. And so this is going to be just a general topic going over injectors, and I'm going to try not to dig too deep into the other things that go along with them because it's another discussion, but we'll just see what happens here. So here's the basics when it comes to choosing injectors. Obviously, as a lot of you guys know, there are OBS trucks, the 94 to 97 trucks, then we have the 99 to 2003 trucks, the Super Duty trucks. And from the factory, they had two different kinds of injectors. From the factory, old body style trucks, the 94 to 97 trucks, had what's called Aaa Code Injectors, which is a 90cc injector. And the way that injectors are rated, I guess maybe we should take that step back. The way injectors are rated is in cc's, and so typically, if you're looking at injector sizing, you're going to see maybe codes, you're going to see stages, whatever. But the numbers are what matters. The numbers are going to be presented in two or three numbers, / and then two more numbers. Or maybe one more number. And so one example would be with this Aaa code, right? This Aaa code in an OBS truck it would be presented as a 90 / 0. And so it's a 90cc injector with a 0% overstock, or AKA stock nozzle, because it's a stock injector. And what that means is the cc's is not the quantity of fuel that the injector holds. It's not the quantity of fuel that can be injected by one injector. It is the quantity of fuel that a single injector will inject over 1,000 injection events. And so that number, it's not what it sounds like. Just keep that in mind that is what it means. But we're just going to call them what they are, which is going to be in cc's. So we've got Aaa Code Injectors, the Super Duty trucks, the the early 99 trucks. So the 98 and early 1999 build date trucks had Aaa Code Injectors. The Aaa codes is where they switched to a split shot injector, which you've probably heard of. If you're looking at injectors, you've heard of single shots and split shots and hybrids or whatever. Split shots, all that means is that there is a pilot event. There is a short event, injection event that happens mechanically before the main injection event happens on every shot, and that's all that means. So the conversion to single shots, every injector that is not a stock Super Duty injector is pretty much always going to be a single shot. It doesn't have to be, you'll refer to as A codes. It doesn't have to be a 160 or 180 or 200, whatever. Anything that is not an AD code or an AB code is probably going to be a single shot, which just means it does not have pilot injection, aka one shot, not two. Moving up into the AB codes, those are they move about 120 cc's ish of fuel at max capacity, of usable fuel. Now, an AB code actually is a 160 cc injector. You just don't get the full benefit of that injector because so much of it is lost to pilot injection, which is why you can stick an AC code or a stage 1 or a 160 injector in an early 99 or any Super Duty truck, and it will gain power even though it's technically the same size injectors, because you're gaining all of that fuel into one event instead of losing it to pilot injection that is not gaining you power. All right, moving on to the next one. Late 99 to 03 trucks, all the later model Super Duty trucks, they had AD codes, so alpha delta code injectors. These are a 100 and they move like usable fuel. They're going to move around 140-ish, 145 cc's of fuel, somewhere in there. There's debates, but somewhere in that range. And those injectors are the equivalent of a 180 cc single shot injector, if you will. This isn't being technical here, just the specifics. 180 cc injector versus the AB codes, which are technically 160 cc injector. Again, you're losing that around 20 cc's or so across 1,000 injection events per injector to pilot injection, which is not making power. All right, so the next thing up from there is going to be kind of what we touched on. It would be a stage 1 and AC code or a 160 injector. So what that means is it's 160 cc's. It's a single shot. It's a 7-to-1 injection ratio. This is going to get crazy now. And it is a stock nozzle. The 160 meaning 160 cc's /0 meaning stock nozzle. Now, a good way to think about it would be all A code injectors, and this is how I typically refer to them. All A code injectors, so like in the case of stock, it's an AA, AB, AD. Even though the OBS injectors are 90 cc's with a stock nozzle and they're single shot, and AB codes and AD codes are 140 to 120 cc's, and they're a split shot. They're still an A code injector, and the A code injector means that it is a 7-to-1 injection ratio injector. What that means is the injection ratio is that it means two things. It means whatever your injection pressure is, so your high pressure oil pump supplies your oil to the injectors or to the rails, which supplies it to the injectors. And whatever that pressure is, your ICP or your injection control pressure, is then multiplied by the intensifier piston in the injector, and it changes by that multiplication factor, so in this case 7-to-1, what your injection pressure into the cylinder is. So let's say in the case of an A code injector, 7-to-1 injection ratio, let's say you're running wide open throttle, you've got a tune in the truck, now you can see 3,000 psi of injection pressure. Your ICP, your high pressure oil pressure in the rails. Well, because it's 7-to-1 injection ratio, that means that we're going to have 7 times 3,000 which would be 21,000 psi of actual fuel injection pressure into the cylinder out of the nozzle of the injector. The other only common size, there were other, people messed around with stuff in the past. People don't do that anymore, but there were like B codes and stuff, which were like a 6-to-1 injection ratio. But the most common is going to be either stock, which is 7-to-1 injection ratio, or it's going to be hybrids, which what the hybrids means is that it's a 5-to-1 injection ratio. And so you do lose a lot of, the argument can be made anyway that you're going to lose atomization, and you do. I guess the argument, I can't say that. The argument should be made that you'll lose atomization by switching to a 5-to-1 injection ratio, because you're going down from a maximum of 21,000 psi of injection pressure out the nozzle to 15,000 psi of injection pressure out the nozzle. 3,000 psi, we're talking at max ICP, 3,000 psi at 5-to-1, so 3,000 psi times 5, which would be 15. And so you lose a lot of injection pressure. That's fine. But the problem, okay, what's the best way to say that? Even though the argument could and should be made that you're losing injection pressure, we don't have a choice. And so one of the problems that we run into is we see a lot of injectors like that I hate. I don't know why they exist. If any injector builders are listening to this, I implore you, please stop selling, or at least give me a good reason why you keep selling a stage 2 injector, anything from a 160-80 or 160-100 or a 180-80 or 180-100. Like, stop selling them. They are terrible injectors. An Aaa Code injector with an 80 or 100% nozzle is totally pointless. And the problem is that we can't. So let's say you have a great situation. You have a high pressure oil pump that keeps up with your injectors. You have a great high pressure oil pump in your truck. You have a adrenaline, you have a CNC stage 2, you have a T500, whatever, take your pick. You stick a 180 cc injector with a 100% nozzle in that truck. One, they're incredibly hard. They're like unstable. They're incredibly hard to tune. They're incredibly hard to make stable and to make clean. And so all the issues that we face, or a huge amount of issues we face, are from guys running those injectors because they are very hot. They tend to be, like, runnability-wise, they tend to be very hot. They tend to be very smoky. They tend to be very hard to make idle smoothly. They're just all around not great, and that capacity shouldn't make that kind of power. If you want more power, just get a hybrid. But at the end of the day, here's what matters. That injector will never be able to. Usually, that injector cannot inject the full capacity at a higher pulse width situation because it cannot move oil fast enough, because there are not flow side mods on that small of an injector like there would be on a bigger injector, and they require so much more. Because here's the other part of this. At 7-to-1 injection ratio, not only are you running on that multiplication factor by your ICP versus your oil side injection control pressure versus your injection pressure into the cylinder. I'm just going to give a random number. This isn't how this works, but just so I can explain it. Let's say for every cc of fuel on a 7-to-1 injection ratio that you want to inject, every cc of fuel you want to inject is going to take 7 times that much oil to inject it. Now, like I said, those aren't exact numbers. Like, it doesn't work by cc's in that way, but just to give like a broad idea of how this works. On a 5-to-1 injection ratio, it only takes 5 times as much oil to inject the same quantity of fuel. So if you're trying to run a fairly high capacity injector extremely fast, because a 100% or 80% nozzle at that pressure, at that injection ratio, is going to inject so quickly and it requires so much oil, it doesn't really matter what you do. The injector cannot fill with oil fast enough. And so, nor can the rails. And so unless you're running like dual high pressure oil pumps or something that's massively supplying so much, such an excess of oil easily to the rails, they just don't work. So don't ever buy a stage 2 injector, please. And if you do, I don't want it in your truck. Okay, so counting out stage 2s, the next thing we're going to see is small hybrids. Usually this is going to be in the range of like a 205/30 or a 200/30. So a 200cc injector with a 30% nozzle or 200cc injector with an 80% nozzle. As far as I'm aware, there's only 3 people that offer a 200 or 205cc injector that's a hybrid. I think Swamps does, Full Force does, and Rosewood does. I think. I do not like 205/30s, and let me tell you why. I don't think 205/30s make a lot of sense because a 30% nozzle is the limiting factor at that capacity. The only reason that we need a bigger nozzle on an injector is so we can either get more fuel out in the same amount of time, more capacity out in the same amount of time, or to get the same amount of fuel out in less time. However you want to look at it, it's the same concept. The problem that we run into is you cannot effectively inject 200 cc's worth of fuel into your cylinders with a 30% nozzle in a reasonable amount of time. Now, lots of people will disagree with that. Lots of people will say you can, and they're willing to extend pulse width out far enough that you can. But the thing to understand with how injection works, and like this is the main thing with tuning. Like this is the very bare bones concept of like tuning and trying to make power with the 7.3. There are only 2 ways that we get fuel into the cylinders. We have pressure, we have our injection pressure, our ICP supplied by our high pressure oil pump, and we have time, which is our pulse width. Pulse width is how long it's injector on time, could be called. It's how long your injector stays open for during an injection event. So you have your pulse width and you have your injection pressure. We're limited by the way injectors are built, by the limitations we have with the 7.3. We're limited to around 3,000 psi of injection pressure, of usable pressure. So if we're limited to 3,000 psi of injection pressure, that's all we got. That's all we can do. Maybe give or take a little bit, but just for the sake of argument here, or sake of understanding, we're just going to say it's 3,000 psi. Once we max out injection pressure, now all that's left is time. Now, as your RPMs go up, your pistons are moving faster. They're moving up and down faster, and your window to inject fuel shortens. It becomes a lot shorter. The higher the RPM, the shorter that window gets. And so the problem that we run into is we don't have very much time to inject fuel. And one of these days I'll have to pull up on a calculator and kind of show you guys like what that window looks like. And, we kind of run into some problems where there's injector refill time. And if you're running at really high RPM and you extend pulse width too far, then there isn't enough time between injection events for the injector to properly refill with fuel. So there's issues that come up there. But basically, what we've decided on is between trying to spray inside the bowls at high RPM and staying within injection windows where we have enough refill time, all of that, we do not believe that we should run more than 4 milliseconds of pulse width. Again, I'm being very basic here, but around 4 milliseconds of pulse width on a 7.3. What that means is you could make just as much power at 4 milliseconds at 3,000 psi with a 160/30 or a 180/30 or a 175/30 as you can with a 205/30. Because in that time, with that pressure, we cannot inject enough fuel for it to matter. And so my argument against the 205/30s is that we cannot make more power with them, and you're going to pay a lot more money for a small hybrid like that than you would pay for an equivalent, Aaa Code injector that's going to really make, seat of the pants especially, the same amount of power. So unless you're willing to, your tuner or whatever's willing to run a lot more pulse width, which, whatever, it's a prerogative, they'll have their reasons why, it's not going to gain you anything to do that. The next thing is, the other reason I don't like a 205/30 is because if you can't make more power, why spend that $500 to not have to buy a high pressure oil pump? That's the argument I hear a lot. I want 205/30s. I heard they're great. I won't need a high pressure oil pump, and versus like a 180/30, and so I'll just buy the 205/30s. Well, why would you spend $500 more to buy an injector that isn't going to make more power for a truck that's going to need a high pressure oil pump at some point, because it's going to fail. It's probably weak anyway. And just because they're hybrids does not mean that a weak pump is going to keep up with them. We see that happen a lot where the high pressure oil pump is a big problem. So it makes more sense if you want a 30% nozzle, if you want the capabilities and the power of a 30% nozzle, it would make a whole lot more sense to just go ahead and run a 160 or 180/30. And then if you need it, or at the same time, buy a good high pressure oil pump, something like a CNC Fabrication Stage 1. It's a great pump for a good price. It'll cost about the same as the difference between those two injectors, and it's going to get you about the same result. And now, boom, you've replaced 2 parts for the price of 1. So that's my reason why. And people are willing to have their own opinions, their own arguments there. It's up to you, but that's my logic. And I say that a lot, so I figured I'll throw it on here. So the next step up really is usually going to be something in the neighborhood of a 160/0 to a 180/30, something in that range. Again, I'm nixing the 205/30 from the conversation. Where it comes into play, the difference between do I want a stage 1 or do I want a stage 1.5? So do I want a 160/0 or a 180/0 with stock nozzle, or do I want a 160 or a 180cc injector with a 30% nozzle? Is what do you do with the truck? If all you do with the truck is you're going to have it at a tow tune, a daily tune, or a street tune, it's mainly just going to be towing and driving around. You're not the kind of person that's ever going to put it in a race tune. It doesn't really matter what it does when that happens. Then you will not gain anything by having a 30% nozzle or paying more money for a stage 1.5 injector versus a stage 1 injector, because that nozzle is not doing anything beneficial. There is plenty of time to get enough fuel out to do the job with a stock nozzle in those situations. So a 160/0 or a 180/0 would make sense. Getting a 30% nozzle, the only time that 30% nozzle is really going to make a difference is when you're wide open throttle in a race tune, everything else is working well together. The 30% nozzle is going to make another, maybe 20 to 40 horsepower more. But in every other scenario, it's not going to be a noticeable difference. So you can save your money. If you're the kind of person who's like, man, I just want to get something that's going to fit well with my truck. I want to tow with it. I want to daily with it. Sometimes I want to play with it. I do throw it in a race tune once in a while. I like to goof off, but I want it to be reliable. I don't want to huck my rods, yada, yada, whatever. If that's you, and you do want to be able to make some power with it, then a stage 1.5, the 30% nozzle makes sense, because there's going to be a scenario where you will use that fuel. And 40 horsepower is enough to matter, but it isn't if you're going to be working on something that you're just towing with it. So one more thing an argument I'd make, and I'm going to touch on this quick because we're flying through time here and there's so much more to cover. On OBS trucks, on the 94 to 97 trucks, a stage 1 injector makes so much sense. I've got a whole video about this on YouTube. If you go back and look at OBS, I think it's 300 to 400 horsepower towing builds or something like that. It's going to be 5, 6, 7 videos back on our YouTube channel, just 1023. So check it out, because kind of cover it a lot more in depth for 40 minutes or something like that. But the basics are this: because it's an Aaa Code injector, because it has a stock nozzle, a 160/0 or an AC code or a stage 1, whatever you want to call it, because that's what it is, which is the same thing as stock, other than it just has more capacity, that injector will run exactly like stock without tuning. And so what that means is, if you do not need the power that you could get from a larger injector, and the goal is, again, just towing, daily, whatever, like we already covered, then the stage 1 injector will give you the ability to have very easy diagnostics. So if you ever have to take it to a shop or something, that's one thing. Shops don't know what to do. Most shops don't know what to do with a modified 7.3, because if you take the tuning out of the equation, they run like crap, and so it's really hard to diagnose a miss or some sort of runnability issue. And you leave the tuning in the equation, then looking at data, if you're trying to look within spec on something, it's not going to be like stock, and so they're not going to know what they're looking at or how to diagnose it. On an OBS, stage 1 injectors run just like stock without tuning, so you can remove your chip. Diag is super easy. One more thing I'd say to that is an actual AC code or a 160/0 injector. If you spend a lot of time hot shotting or whatever, you're away from home, you rely on the truck, you can get an AC code injector from Alliant or Cat or Tractor Supply or whatever. There's lots of places you can get an AC code because an AC code injector or a 160 was an OEM size on the T44E International trucks, and so they're readily available. So if you ever broke down somewhere, you couldn't wait for a warranty, you needed to get one fast, the chances are you can probably get one. And anything else that's a modified injector with a bigger nozzle is not going to be the case. So that's one reason, if that's you, that it could make sense. The next thing up from there is going to be, like I said, the 20580s. Now, any hybrid injector, so 5-to-1 injection ratio injector with an 80% nozzle, is going to do the same thing in almost every scenario. So I should say any capacity of hybrid injector that's available with the same nozzle on both is going to do the same thing, or the same nozzle on all of them is going to do the same thing. What I mean by that is, because it's capacity over time, what happens is the longer you hold an injector open, so let's just say at a set injection pressure, the longer you hold the injector open with pulse width, which is going to be, the more fuel you're demanding. So the hotter the tune, the heavier the pedal, think that way. All that's happening is the plunger in the injector is moving down, injecting more fuel. So there's a certain point where, let's say you had a 250-80 and a 200-80. A 250-80 and a 200-80 are going to run exactly the same until pulse width and pressure get to the point where you have exceeded, where you've gone past 200 cc's worth of fuel being injected. And I hope that makes sense. Another thing Aaa Turbos did, Aaa Turbos put up a video probably about a year ago about like how 7.3 injectors work, and he used a syringe to kind of like demonstrate like the physical process. And I think if you can check that video out too on YouTube or their Facebook channel or the Facebook page, there's good information on there, like if you want a visual of what I'm trying to say. But until you get past where 200 cc's is being injected in this scenario, they're going to do exactly the same job. So think tow tune, daily tune, probably even a street tune. They're all going to do the same job. It doesn't matter what the capacity is because it's the same injection ratio and the same nozzle size. So theoretically, you could put a 238, if you know you want an 80% nozzle, you want to get up to like that, 470 to 480 horsepower range. You could put a 238-80 in it, or 250-80. You could put a 300-80 in it. I don't really care. It's you can make that you can get 200 cc's worth of fuel out of it and get up to around like that high 400 horsepower mark. That's totally feasible. And so the argument can be made, if a 205-80 and a 238-80 are the same price, why not do that? Well, the reason that I would recommend a 205-80 is so that you have a mechanical limiter. And so for people that, if you get new tuning, you get tuning from somebody, like if you buy injectors, you buy 205-80s from us, we're going to run it down at a point where it won't matter what happens. You're safe. But if you put a 238-80 in it and you only want to be able to make 480 horsepower, we have to keep pulse back a little bit. So if you bought it from us and then later you get tunes from somebody else or whatever, I'm just going, scenario there. You get tunes from somebody else that doesn't know you only want 200 cc's worth of fuel, then, it's very likely that you could end up with way too much fuel if you're worried about your bottom end or whatever, and it's not what your build was intended for. And so the 205-80s just act as a mechanical limiter because there just isn't fuel there. If pulse width is too long, the injector's empty and it's just empty. It's not going to do anything else. It's not going to inject more fuel than is possible from the physical size. And so that's the only reason I like them. So again, if you want to be in the 480-ish horsepower range, and that is what you want, then sure, go for 205-80. And if you're comfortable with it and you understand how this works, then do a 238-80 because it gives you room to grow if you ever want to. Now, where I would recommend that, why would I say a stage 1.5 injector versus a 205-80? Because that's a big debate. I see that a lot. Once we nix the 205-30s, those are the two sizes we hear, everybody wants. And it's kind of, I'll put it this way, kind of like I said earlier. anytime your intention is to have the ability to make more power, it's going to require a bigger turbo to effectively make that power. The bigger turbo you have, the higher in the RPM band it's going to move, or the higher the RPM, it's going to move your power band. And by power band, I just mean where you're effectively able to make power and stay on top of the turbo and have enough air to cool the fuel to make that power. And so the bigger you go with injectors, the bigger turbo you have, the bigger the loss in drivability for normal day-to-day and towing tasks. And it gets even worse if you've got bigger tires or if you've got or if you've got a manual transmission, because you don't have a converter that can kind of make up some of that for you. And so for guys where if you spend a lot of time towing, you spend a lot of time daily driving, I'm just going to assume, and again, this has to be more in depth with each person, but I'm just going to assume you probably aren't going to want to deal with the problems that come along with the 205/80 or an 80% nozzle in general. Is it possible? Do people like it? Do people like a 230/80 with a 366 or something like that? Sure, absolutely. But it isn't for everybody, and it isn't all just, sunshine and unicorns and rainbows. It can be kind of terrible. If you're used to a stock truck and how responsive a stock truck is, you're probably going to hate it. And so that's one of the questions we ask is like, how long have you driven this truck? Do you have tuning on this truck? If you've had your truck for 20 years and it's been bone stock this whole time and you don't even have a tune in it, man, you are not going to be happy with a 500 horsepower setup. You're going to hate how that truck drives. And I see that a lot. So another point I guess I'd make is if you've made the wrong choice on turbo, because the relationship between the fuel injectors and turbo is huge. It's everything for how your truck will drive. If you make the wrong choice on turbo and you go too big and you choose the wrong size, don't compensate by thinking putting a bigger injector in it is going to make it better, because it won't. It's going to make it worse. So don't make your problems worse because you made one bad choice. That's all I got to say about that. So where do we make the right choice? 230/80s, 250/100s, anything in that range is going to do 500 to 550, somewhere in there. Let's say 525 to 550. That's what that injector is going to be capable of. Does it matter whether you have a 230/80 or a 238/100 or a 250/80 or 250/100? I mean, all these sizes, there's so many of them. It doesn't matter. Any one of those injectors is not going to give you a seat of the pants difference in feel. Like, it's not, a 230/80 in a perfect scenario versus a 250/100 in a perfect scenario. It's a couple cc's, a tiny bit bigger nozzle. It's not a huge difference. Will it make more power on a dyno with the 250/100? Maybe, probably. Maybe another 15 horsepower somewhere in there. Maybe we can say a 230/80 or an 80% nozzle is a good 525-ish horsepower injector, and a 250/100 is a good 550-ish horsepower injector. Does that 20-ish horsepower matter? No, doesn't matter. I don't care which one you get. Tuning is the same for all of them. They're going to run the same. They're going to make the same power. It does not matter. So take your pick however you want to. If that's what you want, that's what you decide on for your goal, go for it. Choose whatever you want. It's going to do the same thing. I don't really feel like I need to dignify anything bigger than that with an answer on here, because that's a totally different discussion. But one thing I will say is, if you care about your truck driving nice, idling nice, or even having any resemblance of those things, don't get 200% nozzles. Just don't do it. It's a terrible idea. The chances of the truck running good by really anyone's standards are very low. And the chances of anybody being able to easily tune it, especially if you don't know what you're doing, you don't have the ability to data log anything, it's not a good idea. So if that's the kind of build you're after or something big like that, then you're best to you either already know, you've already done your research, or you just need to have a conversation like one-on-one with somebody. A couple more things I want to point out here. Because the relationship between injectors and turbos are so important, and those two do need to work together, this is not to tell you which injectors you need. It's just to give you an idea of how they work, how sizing works, and maybe an idea on how to choose them. what I would encourage you to do, like I mentioned in the beginning, is if you're interested in getting injectors or a turbo, or, before you do anything with your truck, talk to somebody who knows. And I'll just throw this out there on top of like what we do. If for whatever reason you want to talk to somebody else or whatever, go for it. I believe that Charlie at KC Turbos, I think he does a great job. I know I've brought him up several times here, so he does a great job. Mario G, we've had him on a couple times. Night Shift Diesel, he does a great job. He has a very good understanding of how these components will work together, and I think that he will give good advice. I'm sure there are other people that will do the same thing, but those are just two of them outside of what we do that I think you could probably count on to give fairly good advice. We see way too often that guys have come to us after, because we're a tuning company, and a lot of times, people come to us after they've already done a build, after they've bought the parts or whatever, and it's not like they've gotten just terrible advice. And it makes me sad when we have to be the ones to tell somebody, it's like, there's nothing we're going to be able to do. We might be able to help you a little bit and make it better for whatever reason, but there's nothing we're going to be able to do to fix the fact that you have a terrible setup that's never going to work well. And we just see it way too often. And if nothing else, if you know anybody with a 7.3 and they're somewhat interested in buying injectors, just if nothing else, just like at least have them listen to this first. Before they do that. I don't care where you buy them somewhere else. It doesn't matter to me, but just, I hope that somehow this, what we're doing and what other companies are doing that are trying to educate people, with the stuff that we know, to make good choices, is worth it. So I think I'll wrap that up for today. We're at about 40 minutes. I appreciate you guys listening. I love feedback. Now, we don't get a lot of feedback because of the podcast. Since we started posting these on YouTube also, maybe if we get a few comments here and there, but the majority of listeners, like any of you that are listening, are going to listen on a podcast platform. If you can leave a review, if you're on iTunes, you can leave a review. I would really appreciate that, because like I said, the intention of this is to get information out in front of more people, and the more people follow it, the better rankings we get, the more reviews, whatever we get. Even just if you want to give it stars, that's great. Same thing on YouTube. If you watch these on YouTube, like it. I guess if you want to subscribe, but just at the very least, like the video, maybe leave a comment or something so it keeps it going up. Our goal is to help people, prevent people from making bad choices that are going to make for a bad experience with their truck and waste a lot of money. And that's ultimately what we're after. And the more people we can get in front of to do that, the better. But appreciate you guys listening. If you want to talk on this podcast, down below, you'll find a link to a form you can fill out. Basically, just see what you want to talk about, see what you drive. If you want to shop, you want to talk about your products, or you want to ask questions about the things that I know, or you want to have a discussion, I'm down for it. Want to talk about your build, I'm down for that too. So find that in the link in the description. If you guys are interested in buying parts for your truck, you can go to 1023diesel.com. That'll be linked below also. We'll talk to you guys next time.